Hi, welcome to HowtoDandD. My name is Fred Wheeler and today I want to talk about Dungeons & Dragons. Not specifically Dungeons & Dragons 5e, it could be any type of Dungeons & Dragons story, and honestly could be applied to any roleplay game or story that you tell, even if it's not a roleplay game. Okay, here's the first thing. How do you tell a great Dungeons & Dragons story? Well, that's a good question. And there's lots of moving parts. I have spent a bit of time breaking it all down into a bit more bite-sized material so it's a little bit easier to follow. So creating a great written Dungeons & Dragons story is really, it's not the same thing as telling a story verbally. And I know a few people will get this confused. It is simply not the same process. It's not the same skill set, which is good for you if you are not good at writing a Dungeons & Dragons story that has nothing, it's not related to your ability to tell a good story. So how do you tell a great Dungeons & Dragons adventure story? There's the crux of it, right? How do we actually do that? We start off with our story element, which is usually our plot. If every story has a plot of some kind, and there is basically only one plot line that applies to pretty much all Dungeons & Dragons adventure stories. Doesn't matter what sort of Dungeons & Dragons game you are playing, the chances are the elements are exactly the same. And that's this. There is a villain who wants something. That's all it has to be, nothing more than that. Or you could just say that somebody wants something. Now, what do they want? Well, they could have a desire to grab a lot of different things, actually, as it happens. But what you want to sort of focus on is things like power, money, maybe a magical artifact or a non-magical artifact, as Sauron from Lord of the Rings was obsessed in getting the Master Ring, the ring that would rule them all. Revenge, slaves, maybe to perform some sort of construction or something else. It's really, up to that particular villain that you're building for your story. Or maybe they are after a particular kingdom. There are lots of different things that villains will be looking for, but that is essentially it. The villain wants something and that's it. That's your basic storyline. First thing that a dungeon master needs to do is get the player's attention before starting the adventure story. I know that sounds like a hard task, and yes, it can be a very difficult task to begin with, but it's really important, probably more important than a lot of people understand sometimes. Don't start your adventure or telling your story till you have your players' attention. If the players don't have their attention on the Dungeon Master, do not start. It's really important. How do you get your players' attention? It's a very good question. I've actually talked about how to get your attention focused on the Dungeon Master from the players, but I would have to do an entire video topic on another day to actually cover all of that. So I can't cover that element if that's the question you have. But there are lots of different ways of doing it. Okay, now I know that's a sort of a shortcut and say I haven't answered that part, but we don't have time to add another 20 minutes to this video. First off, you're going to use the 3-act story structure. Okay, that's the 3-act story structure. It's the structure that all stories will use no matter what story it is. There are some variations, but this is the one that's tried, it's tested, it works, and it's simple. And it's really important that when you tell a story that the simple stories work best. It's the stories that are complex and a little bit involved that can be very, very difficult to tell. Your first element to Act 1 is the setup or adventure hook. This is where you make it clear that there is a villain or somebody who wants something, just as I talked about before, and the players' characters are going to stop them. That's essentially the setup. Nothing more to it. Very, very simple. Number 2, or Act 2, is the confrontation or conflict with the story. And that's the interaction between the players' characters and the villain, or whatever is taking place. And when I say a villain can take many different forms. This could involve something like combat, social interactions, exploration, all manner of different things, okay? All of those things can be involved as part of the confrontation or conflict. That's Act 2. That's the body and meat of your story. The last part of your story is very important, and that is Act 3 is resolution or the climax with the villain. Now, the resolution is really important because a lot of people, I think, nowadays have forgotten the concept of storytelling, and they try to use sort of new vogue ideas. What you're trying to do is all of the conflict and confrontation that occurred in Act 2 is resolved in Act 3. If you can't do that, your story is going to be quite weak, and sometimes it can work by changing that formula, but often you will find that it will actually just cause a whole bunch of hassles for you that you really don't need. Okay, here is the body of the stuff that you need to actually deal with as a dungeon master. This is what you need to achieve in your players, in their minds, okay, and in their motivations. When you're running through your story, running through your adventure game, there are essentially 5 different elements that you need to achieve in the player. And what they're going to do, and I'm not going to tell you the chemicals behind it, but there are 3 basic chemicals that are involved in storytelling that are really important. And these 5 elements will activate them, and that's the thing you want to focus on. The first one, number 1, is we want to elicit suspenseful surprise. Suspense and surprise is very important with any story. If you don't have those elements, it's very hard to maintain focus on the player or the person listening to the story. So that is actually really important. Number 2 is actually, would you believe it, a desperate desire, absolute desperate desire to see the conclusion of a cliffhanger in a story. Stories should have cliffhangers. They don't all have cliffhangers, but they should have a cliffhanger because of what they do to the person who is listening to the story. So make sure that you're imparting that part in. So the cliffhanger is number 2. Number 3 is allow your players to be collaborative in the storytelling process. By all means, you are, as the dungeon master, telling a story. You are the storyteller. But you're not the only storyteller, so you need to actually allow the players to be collaborative. Number 4, would you believe it, is about character. It's actually very important to get your players to have empathy for the other characters in the party, and particularly for non-player characters in your party. Why do we want to do this? Well, the thing is, with anything that revolves empathy is we're activating a different part of the brain. Okay, the first 3 activating one part of the brain and one chemical. This one is activating another one. Okay, we want empathy. This is how we get tied in and hooked into a story, by developing empathy for the characters in that story. So we need to do that as well. And number 5 is, would you believe it, laughter. Laughter and or happiness. That's what we want to get out of our players. So with those 5 things in mind, how do we actually do that? So you've talked about what we need, so how do we do it? So we're going to talk about that right now. So how do you do this verbally? The basics behind it are very, very simple. You're going to use your words, you're going to use your body language, you're going to use lots of different things. I'm going to go through each element and sort of highlight how I would talk about doing it, and some tricks, particularly the first one. The first one is really important. So let's start off with suspense, mystery, and surprise. Those are all sort of tied up. When I talk about suspense, mystery, and surprise, I'm really essentially talking about the same thing. One individual, Alfred Hitchcock, was really good at developing stories through film that built up suspense, mystery, and surprise. So what I would suggest you do is go and watch some of those movies. It'll give you an idea of how they are telling the story. That's one part. When it comes to yourself and how you apply that and do that in your own game, well, guess what? You can build up suspense, mystery, and surprise by stopping, pausing as you are talking as the dungeon master. Deliberately leaving out details. Now, these could be details that are related to something that is requiring the player's character to investigate, forcing them to actually find out those details, or deliberately leaving out details and just giving broad brushstrokes, forcing the players to actually find out those details, even though their character can see them. What are we trying to do? We're trying to force them to ask questions. If we get our players asking questions, we know they are awake. We know that they are probably not on their phone if they're asking questions, and we know that they are invested because they are asking a question. So that is one of the key aspects to teaching, as it happens, is actually forcing questions. And the best way to do that is to leave out detail, create mystery. Okay, another good way of doing that is deception about the story consequences. So even though we present something, we are being quite deceptive about what is actually being put out there, which means that the consequences in the story, even though, say, you come across a blood trail, that blood trail may represent the trail that is left by the victim from a murder. It might be just the blood trail from a chicken that was butchered the day before for a dinner. It might be, so those are the sorts of things I'm talking about. By creating deception in the story, we are going to create surprise and mystery. That's another way of doing it. I like to sort of, when I talk about mystery and surprise, I like to think of it like a magician. Magicians use misdirection. They focus on those aspects of their art. So what they're doing is, what you see is not what's taking place. They present you with something, and while you're focusing on the thing that they are showing you, something else is taking place behind the scenes. And that's the same sort of tool that you can use as a dungeon master when you're talking through your story. Okay, here's a really good one. And of course, I'm sure a lot of people have lots of familiarity with this. Star Wars. Let's talk about Star Wars. I'm talking about things like describing unexpected situations or character behavior. Unexpected situations and character behavior. So, for example, Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, Luke Skywalker is in a duel with Darth Vader and loses his hand and winds up discovering that his father is not dead. In fact, his father is Darth Vader. That is what I'm talking about when I talk about unexpected situations and character behavior. Another great thing about Dungeons and Dragons, which is a pro and a con sometimes, and that is the use of dice. The use of dice or rolling dice adds a random element, which means that when you try to resolve a particular situation or action in the game, whether it be around combat or something else, it doesn't matter. There's a random element. There's a chance of success and failure. That adds in that unknown element. Hence, surprise, mystery, and suspense is being built into your player. Okay, so that's the first one I was talking about. And I did warn you guys that there's going to be a lot of information here. Okay, number 2. Let's talk about the cliffhanger. Cliffhangers have to be created wherever possible. And what is a cliffhanger? Essentially, it's stopping the story at a key point where there's tension. That's it. It's very, very simple. So wherever possible, you won't be able to do it every single time, but wherever possible, build that in somewhere. And the best place to build it in is either just before a break, or, which is fine, or at the end of your game session. I often find it's very difficult to build in a cliffhanger, which does not have to be combat orientated, at the end of your game session. Sometimes it doesn't work, but you can have a cliffhanger and then say, and now we're going to take a break and I'm going to go to the toilet. And you have just built in your cliffhanger, for those of you who are worried about how I could actually possibly do that. I want to go back to Star Wars again and The Empire Strikes Back, because there's been a lot of Star Wars talk recently, and why not? Now, at the end of The Empire Strikes Back, we know that Luke Skywalker has been saved by Leia after he lost his hand and falls down the chute. And then, of course, Han Solo has been frozen in carbonite, and he's being trucked off by Boba Fett. And the rescue mission. We end right on the rescue mission. We don't know what's going to happen to Han Solo. And then we have to wait till the next part of the story. That is a really good way to end your adventure story in that part. Now, cliffhangers are not designed or supposed to be set at the end of Act 3. For those of you who are wondering, okay, you were talking about the act structure of, setup, confrontation, and then resolution. So the easiest way to understand this is when these stories were put together by Star Wars, they weren't really written and put together in concept of I can put it on film. They had to break the entire story up into pieces. So the idea is not to put your cliffhanger as your resolution in Act 3, for those of you who are wondering, just if you were getting confused by my example. Okay, let's go on to the third part, and that is telling your part of the story with energy and excitement, and be expressive. That does not mean that you need to talk in an accent. It does not mean that you need to act out the characters, although that's very good if you can. But you do need to be energetic, you need to be excited, and you need to be expressive so that you can pull your players in. If you can do that, you're doing well. Here's one of the problems that a lot of dungeon masters fall into, and that is, okay, I'm going to do all of that, but when the players get their part, when they get to do their actions, they will sort of run over the top of their characters and not really let them take part in the story. When players tell their part of the story with their character, don't shut it down. Don't shut it down. Modify it by all means, but do not shut it down. That does not mean that anything goes for your player characters. That doesn't mean they get to do anything they want. They can try anything. Doesn't mean it'll work, but they can try anything. Don't shut it down though. Alright, number 4. That is, pull on the player's heartstrings. Get them emotional. I've talked about getting players emotional before. And how do you do this? Tell the sad story. I'm talking about Lord of the Rings. Boromir. That is the sad part of the story, right? Now the final confrontation that Boromir has. That means, truthfully, the easiest way, somebody's got to die. It doesn't have to be a player character. It can be an NPC. But it has to be somebody that the players care about. So do that. Set that up. Kill them off. That's the sad story. Number 5. And that is, how do we get laughter and happiness? Put whimsical elements into your story locations. Characters, traps, magic items. Make your players laugh. That is the last chemical being released into their body that you need to tell a really good story. And for those of you who may have a few beefs with Disney, Disney understands this. You need to finish strong with your story. Have a happy ending. After all the pain and anguish you put the player's character through, finish strong. Happy ending. Eventually it has to happen. Don't go the route of the sad ending. That doesn't mean that you can't have a happy ending even if your party had a total party kill. Okay? Move the story on, keep it going, but finish happy. That's the best way to end any kind of story, in my opinion. And of course, really all of this is just my opinion, also backed up by a lot of research as well. Now, I hope this was useful to you. And if it was, fantastic. I have hundreds of videos for players and dungeon masters with lots of advice on how to play Dungeons & Dragons, and particularly Dungeons & Dragons 5e. This is all based very much on my own personal experience and, as I said, by some research. Now, if you want to support the channel so I keep doing stuff like this, you can do so by using Patreon. You can use the affiliate links down in the description to Amazon and the book depository. You can check out my merchandise. Pardon me. Oh, man. Pollen time. So those are the 3 different ways you can support. Patreon, affiliate links to the book depository or Amazon down in the description, and the merchandise shelf. Otherwise, make sure to share, like, and subscribe. Hit the bell button to be notified when I go live and when I publish new videos. And hey, till next time, keep rolling those 20s.